Up next, we have Jack from Colony in conversation with Christina Frankopan. And Jack's talk is called To Token or Not to Token. That's a mysterious name.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks. I'll only need it for a minute, so I'll just plug it in. I think Christina needs a mic too. Sure, just like that.
Oh, I could just shout.
Hey all. I think first off I need to offer an apology to Miripala. I had promised that I would be wearing full Shakespearean garb for this, but I couldn't find the codpiece this morning, so I had to just abandon the whole idea. So yeah, we're going to be talking about really when you should have a token, when you shouldn't have a token. I feel like maybe this is a topic of conversation that is somewhat below a lot of the OGs that I see in the audience here, but hopefully it'll be useful anyway. So yeah, where do we start, Christina?
Well, I'm assuming everyone knows who you are, but
seems unlikely.
Just very briefly, I'm Christina Frankopan, and I'm a venture partner with Fabric VC, among other things, and I like to work with technologists to support their projects, not just in finding them funding, but also on their operating side as well. So that's who I am. But Jack, maybe you just want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, and I am Jack DeRose. I am with Disabled CEO of a project called Colony, which is, you probably heard Aaron speaking earlier on today, platform for decentralized organizations. There he is. Yeah. Shall we?
Great, yeah, let's do it. So maybe I can just give a bit of we can give a bit of an outline on what we're going to discuss. The token or not token, that's the title of this talk.
That is indeed the question.
That is the million-dollar question,
yeah.
Or billion-dollar question, depending on the month. So what we're going to, the way we thought we'd go through this is to sort of discuss, should you do a token? And then could you do a token? And the context for those two things. And then what should you do if you can't or shouldn't do a token? Where does that leave you? Sort of a general point that we've discussed at length is what, in fact, would the perfect token look like, and how can you try to design that? We wanted to just contextualize a little bit some of our disclosures and biases. We're going to talk a lot of crap about tokens, and we're going to
talk
be
a lot of shit.
a lot of shit. And at times might sound quite negative, but that we may sound slightly cynical precisely because we're very bullish on the future of tokens. And we believe that they will be transformative. It's just that there is a lot of crap out there, and we want to try and encourage people to do it right. So there are a few other disclosures, Jack, that you might want to mention, including, well, we're both invested in tokens.
Yeah, both personally love a cheeky token purchase. Also, we as a project intend to sell a token at some point in the future when we have a mainnet deployment of our protocol. So definitely up on tokens, but yeah, we'll get into under what circumstances.
Okay, so let's start with should you do a token? So what is the best practice for whether you should from the point of view of the actual token design? Do you really need a token? Not you personally, but does one really need a token?
Right, yeah, so I'm just going to actually offload this to somebody else who's put this very, very well. This fella, is it going to show up on here? Where are we? No? Oh dear. We got the screen? Yeah, there he is. So this is Mike Golden. He's an engineer at Consensus. Smart guy, spends a lot of time working on TCRs. In fact, he might have invented the TCR. I'm not sure. Anyway, he has got something which is called Mike's Cryptosystems Manifesto, and I think a lot of projects who've been working in this space for a while will have kind of come to the same conclusions, but he really put it very, very eloquently indeed. So I'm going to share that with you to sort of contextualize everything we're going to talk about. So a token must work as a necessary element of a self-sustaining system, which is a public utility. A token is a necessary element of a system if the use of any other in its place would damage the system's normal functioning. So this was a question which used to be posited as, why can't you just use Ether? Why can't, and now even more so, why can't you just use DAI? Wouldn't that be better? A system is self-sustaining if it would continue to function normally in the indefinite absence of its creators. So is it actually fully open source, fully decentralized? Is it just going to keep on running even if its founders disappear? Which is kind of important given these things that we're building have that property that they can literally outlive their creators. And a system is a public utility if it's permissionless, rent-free, and does something useful. So there we are. That's kind of the context. And this is, I think, what I very much agree with is the kind of fundamental properties that a token should have if it's to be sold and included within a protocol. Otherwise, I think there are fewer rationales for it. And just to further contextualize that, I'm referring specifically to things which are sort of utility tokens and which are fungible. Yeah.
Could you maybe explain how your thought process internally at Colony came to how you came to the decision that you had satisfied those conditions and how you decided when or whether or not to do a token sale in that context?
Sure. So certainly in the very early days of the project, it really wasn't clear whether it would even be possible to issue a token, because what we're trying to do is something, I guess, quite tricky in that we're trying to have a token which sort of represents ownership of an organization and sort of behaves like equity in that organization. Of course, equity is the most security-ish thing you can possibly have. So how do you create that without it being a security and as a necessary component within the system? So that was kind of our starting point. And because we didn't know, we started off by allowing our very first investor to be purchasing something that we created called a safety, which was a sort of precursor to the wildly popular SAFT subsequently, which basically enabled you to purchase tokens or equity, whichever the company ended up raising. And then really it was just very much an iterative process of getting to the eventual system design that we had, in which it is a functional necessity and which was sort of really unavoidable.
Right, so when we were discussing this, we were thinking in terms, okay, of should you do a token? The first hurdle, if you like, then would be, do you really need one? And does it satisfy these criteria that we've just discussed? The second one, then, the next hurdle is about money. So should you be doing this for the money? Under what circumstances and under what criteria should you impose on yourself to be raising money and how much? This is where we start to get cynical, because we've seen people raising too much, certainly for their stage of development, and I think we both feel quite strongly that is a Faustian pact,
right.
And I think maybe it would be useful to share some of the things that we've seen and why that is not necessarily helpful.
Yeah, so having money when you don't have any money definitely feels like it's just this completely unalloyed good. Having more money allows you to do more stuff. But indeed, if you have too much money, then it comes along with a load of other baggage, especially when that money comes from crypto. Things like OPSEC. Are you spending your whole time worried that lots of other people know that you have just received a lot of money, which is practically in cash and in your head? Treasury management. Like, you suddenly go from worrying about your project to worrying about the fact that you've got tens of millions of dollars that you need to make sure stays safe and within your company and is not subject to the vagaries of the markets. what else did we get to?
I mean, that one, I wouldn't underestimate how much stress that causes people.
It's a huge amount of stress.
And indeed, we've seen it go wrong several times without mentioning projects, but
Right.
either just through management systems or just bad timing and so on. So that is causing projects an enormous amount of stress.
And pressure as well, right? So you've gone from 2 dudes in a bedroom, you've just got $25 million in Ether, which has then just doubled. Now you've got a whole bunch of people in your Telegram group saying, when moon?
When Lambo.
Yeah. And this feeling of enormous pressure, even though you've basically got little more than an idea, to actually start really delivering hard upon that. But in practical terms, it just doesn't work that way. You can't just throw 50 people at a problem and hope it's going to get solved. It is a process of building up a team, building in operational processes, talking to customers, understanding whether what you're building is something that's useful, and gradually getting yourself towards product market fit and building the team around that. And then once you do start to feel like you're getting product market fit, then you can start pouring on the cash. And that's when you need the cash. You absolutely don't need it before. It's just a distraction.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect to that we've seen projects running into difficulty, which is kind of cultural dilution that
Right.
comes with building out those teams before you've achieved a product market fit.
Right. Before you've got sort of operational processes and an intentional process towards culture of your organization.
I think that has been a big problem for many of the projects that
Absolutely.
I've spoken to, and indeed also kind of parasitical elements that start attached to you, either because they know that you've got enormous amounts of money or power.
Or indeed the potential to receive enormous amounts of money. Almost there are more of them in our experience, at least.
Yeah, I mean, so raising money does not equal success. I know that sounds incredibly negative, and obviously if you have no money today and you're eating beans and you're working on an open source project, it's difficult, but it's a bit of a Britney Spears project. You don't want to end up in that shaving your head because you've got depression from running a $200 million project. So
Right, because what's raising, insert number of $1 million now, it's really just creating a huge obligation to a bunch of people that you're going to be delivering a return on that, even if ostensibly you're saying that this was a donation or this was a contribution, and really there's no promise of return. Of course, that is implicit.
Yeah, and look, the other aspect of that we discussed is that it encourages also short-term thinking.
Right.
And that's something that we would have liked to try to get away from what we've seen in public equity markets, for example, where you have sort of quarterly reporting and constantly feeling like you have to be delivering on some fictional targets, when actually sometimes you need time to whittle down and focus on your project, and without the pressure of having to, when moon.
Right, and I think that there's kind of more that is revealed from the short-term thinking. And I think as this is also, as a community, it's been hard to really understand how to use token sales in a nuanced way, like because to begin with, a project would sell 90% of their tokens up front, and that was the end of it. There's no possibility of future fundraising. The team would retain, a very small proportion of the tokens, and fortunately, in most of those cases for the projects, the prices obviously of Ether at least has gone through the roof since then, so they're probably fine forever. But it's not so clear that now that would be the case. So if you're giving yourself really only a single opportunity to raise money as a company, you risk overcapitalization in the short term, especially if you are 2 dudes in a bedroom. But then massive undercapitalization later on. There is a huge bet going on there that the underlying token is going to increase in value. If you compare really any current project, with the exception of EOS probably, to something that has actually achieved product market fit and grown as a company, something like Slack, for instance, which has now raised $1.2 billion. You see that even for what is ostensibly a fairly straightforward product, far more straightforward than a lot of the kinds of things that people in this room are thinking about, there is a massive capital requirement once you start to really need to pour on the fuel for growth.
absolutely agree. So how much you raise when and at what, and the timing, I think, is very important, even if you've passed that first obstacle of needing a token, and even if you've satisfied the obstacle of needing the money, how much you raise. I think that is made more difficult by the fact that we are still in quite, and I mean, this area is maturing very rapidly, but I think we're still in a very immature, we have very immature approaches to the idea of valuation in this space, or what network value really means. Mostly, I mean, people are discussing and being very analytical and intellectualizing what network value means, and you can make as many models as you want about it, but a lot of it, let's face it, is finger to the wind and more related to what you can raise than perhaps what fundamental valuation is, certainly for the stage of development of many projects.
Right. And token valuations are far more nuanced than equity valuations would be anyway, right? Because there's no single model. Almost every project has their own slightly different spin on things. It's hard to come up with a common value for all of those.
Yeah, and I think another thing is that actually it's still a very niche community. So it's just simply the number of eyes. There are many eyes, open source eyes on the technical side looking at things, and there are increasingly, let's say, financially specialized eyes looking at valuation models and how we think about valuation in this space. But compared to public equity markets, for example, obviously we're a smaller community, but in terms of the analytical power actually anchoring ideas of what fundamental value looks like or should look like, and really scrutinizing what assumptions are made in those kinds of financial models, or valuation models, if you like, I think there's still a limited but growing group, and I think we still have a way to go before we can say that there's a robust ecosystem of checks and controls about how we're thinking about it at the moment. So let's say that one has satisfied oneself of the need for a token and the need for money, and got a sense of how to approach the valuation, how much to raise. The other thing we talked about is in terms of should you do a token or not, is are you legitimate and can you satisfy legal and regulatory requirements and sleep at night without fear of being shipped off in an orange vest. So you are well known as one of the experts in this space, having taken legal opinion from many. How does one satisfy oneself that one is legitimate, and does it matter?
Well, yeah, this really does fit into the whether you can in fact do a token sale, and getting to the point of being. It seems very, very straightforward, and in fact, I suppose it is very straightforward to sell a token. You create a sale contract and you entreat people to send Ether to it. But in terms of doing it really well, there's a huge amount more to it. It's super complicated and super expensive, increasingly expensive. I think I heard recently actually it's cheaper nowadays to do an IPO than to do an ICO, which seems absolutely mental, but I can well believe it. I mean, the legal fees alone, if you have got the capabilities within your team to design a token such that it fulfills all of the requirements we talked about that Mike specified, you not only have to achieve that, but really if you want to raise money with that token, you also somehow need to magic it into being capable of accruing value, capturing value somehow, whilst also not being a security. Quite tricky. So there's a huge amount of legal work that needs to go into that design process, and you're looking at a minimum of 6 figures, but I know a number of teams that have spent 7 easily, and continue to do so because the ongoing burden of doing these things, even slightly wrong at some point, can just continue to accrue.
On the other side of should or could you do it in terms of legitimacy and satisfying and being compliant, some of the aspects of that are well known. I.e., have you got a live product, or should you be waiting in terms of timing to do something until you have a live product? That is actually an important question in terms of the legality of a token. Right.
Well, we get really deep into the weeds of securities regulations there, which I'm happy to go into. If do you think that's... Yeah, let's wind up.
Yeah, do it.
So the ones that people usually concern themselves with are obviously the US securities laws, because the SEC are known for their global reach, and actually the US securities laws, which they seem quite murky to begin with, but they're relatively easy to understand once you apply yourself to them. And they are, it is possible to overcome those, but as I mentioned, not without substantial amount of legal work. So just in brief, the Howey Test, which is the one that most people are worrying about, states that that a security is an investment of money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profits from the efforts of others. And most usually, you can't, if you're trying to sell a token which is going to accrue value, avoid the investment of money or with the expectation of profits. Like, you want to keep those things. So really, you've got common enterprise and efforts of others that you can look to try and break. And fortunately, Cryptosystems provide us with various different approaches to achieving that. But it's different in each case. In our case, we believe that it breaks both common enterprise and efforts of others, prongs of the Howey Test. But yeah, it's very much on a case-by-case basis, and it requires a lot of work around the specifics of any given protocol.
Yeah, and even notwithstanding that, there remains some marginal element of uncertainty in the sense that nobody
knows.
quite knows what the rules are.
Yeah, and lawyers all different in their opinions.
They're all different, and sometimes they're difficult to engage. I think the point on that really is that it will impact the design. It may impact not only the design of the token economic systems, but possibly also the design of the sale, token sale, if one is to do that. There is another element about whether you should do a token that I think is actually incredibly important, and I think we agree on this, is it ethical actually to do this? And I think in the community so far, mostly ethical elements or moral decisions around whether or not a token should or could be done have been sort of self-regulated. So there's and those discussions in the community have mostly been discreet and quiet, but I think we need to bring these questions out into the open. So when we're talking about the ethics of whether you could or should do it, it's not just a question of whether you have got valid token economics that satisfy those criteria or whether or not you need the money. Maybe there have been cases where people have raised more than they need, and there is a moral dimension to that in the sense that there are many unsophisticated investors in this unregulated market who have and may continue to lose money on that, and I think we need to question as a community whether that is a good thing or not, and how we start thinking about reaching standards or a kind of level of morality that we feel more comfortable with.
Yeah, and that's really difficult, right? Because we're expecting this to be a community that grows. We're expecting it to be welcoming to new people, and also I think, by and large, we want token sales to be a force for good in the world, in both as people purchasing tokens and those that sell them. So I think there's a really big and unsolved problem there as to how we provide appropriate self-regulation and signaling mechanisms to enable people to sort the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that problem is a task for everyone in the community to improve communication and education of the general investor. Because there is an asymmetry of information for people perhaps in this room who are investing, by definition, know more about what they're doing than the man on the Clapham or the woman on the Clapham omnibus who's been persuaded to do it in January this year.
Right. The likes of probably everybody in this room was having almost everybody they knew in January asking them, What's a good token to buy? What's an upcoming ICO that I should know about? All these people that never showed any interest before January.
Basically, every person I've ever met.
Yeah.
So I think it would be nice to see an emergence of standards in terms of how we think about what's ethically correct in terms of whether or not one does a token and how much one raises indeed. And then maybe moving on to can you actually do it? Even if you've satisfied that you're a great community citizen and that this token is needed for the world and that you're raising the exact right amount of capital.
You are the perfect self-regulator in that case.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can you actually do it? Can you achieve it? So how do we think about, we've talked about the legal aspects and so on, but What about other aspects of the legal environment, KYC, AML, but also I think banking, for example, some of the problems that one might encounter that make it difficult to actually achieve this, and maybe we could talk very briefly about the market context as well in terms of can you actually achieve this?
Right, sure. So, I mean, there's, over the course of the last, well, slightly more than 12 months now, but particularly with the focus on last summer, huge number of projects, huge number of money flowing in a largely unstructured way, often just publicizing a contract address and having Ether sent to it. A lot of those projects now have faced some significant difficulties as a consequence of doing it that way, because they have got massive, massive amounts of money they need to be able to do something with. And there is not a bank that will touch them. In some cases, even the most well-known projects in the space have had their banking withdrawn from them and left with, employees to look after, and a very, very difficult and stressful situation to deal with. So that's, even though if we believe that tokens are not securities, which in the right context they can not be, you don't technically need to do KYC and AML, and ideally, given that we all enjoy these kind of decentralization maximalist positions, practically, if you want to be able to deliver on a product and you want to be able to deliver on the promise that you set out to achieve, you need to toe the line a little bit. And if you want to get things like banking, if you want to deal with sort of regulated financial service providers, you need to do KYC and AML. You need to be able to prove that what your source of funds is. So that's, it's achievable.
Huge problem, and an associated problem, I might add, is also working with qualified auditors and accountants. I've heard many stories of auditors who are just like, frankly, we don't know how to account for this on your balance sheet. We're not going to include this on your balance sheet.
Right, and that is even if you've done KYC and AML, because frankly, it's not worth the risk, and they don't have the technical expertise within these firms, large as they may be, to expend the effort, go to the bother within their compliance departments to understand whether they're dealing with people who've contributed to, money laundering for terrorist organizations.
Yeah, no, so I wouldn't underestimate that. So that's something one needs to think through before one actually does it, because there's no point ending up with mountains of ETH if you can't actually do anything with it. Maybe it's worth talking about some of the alternative strategies, because a token sale, there's a token sale strategy even if you've got a token, but you can also go an airdrop route. And
right. So tokens do not necessarily mean token sales.
Correct.
Right. Or at least public token sales or ICOs. There's we can see what Definity did recently, which is shying away from the public token sale, certainly until they have a mainnet deployment, and instead airdropping to some people of their community, which I think was probably a sort of politically necessary, because they'd spent so much time hyping up the fact that they were going to be doing a token sale at some point. That I think they may have been lynched had they not delivered something to the community. So yeah, airdropping is one way of going about it. That is still challenging because you've got problems with Sybil attacks, and that's why CoinList are providing their service. But even then, I was speaking to those guys, and they really had a huge problem with people creating spurious accounts. Which I think has been solved now, but nevertheless it's a problem. People will try it even if there is a KYC process to go through. You could also do it by sort of dropping indiscriminately to accounts, whether it be just to all Ethereum accounts, or perhaps proportional to the amount of Ether in those, if you prefer that approach.
We've all got a bunch of that crap,
Yeah. Absolutely. The new
so
spam.
That's the problem with that, is that indiscriminate means indiscriminate.
Right, but also you could be targeting just people who have already purchased tokens of something that you think is kind of in the same ballpark as you. So, perhaps if you're a game project, you might think, well, who's got the most crypto kisses? I'm gonna send some token to those guys, or Engine Coin, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, it can be useful under our circumstances. I think that's true. So there's a kind of, so what we've discussed is the kind of hierarchy of should you, could you, and how to.
I think there's more to it as well, as the different kinds of ways that you could distribute tokens. I mean, Bitcoin had got a fairly good way of distributing tokens, right, without doing a token sale. That seems to have worked out well for everybody. So, for protocol, doing its thing, do some work for the protocol, get paid. Yes. That's quite nice.
Yes, good point. Yeah, doing useful stuff for the system. But yeah, no. But what we're on the context of can you? So just to talk a little bit about the market environment. I mean, I think that is an important aspect. Right. It is definitely harder to have a successful token sale in the current market for obvious reasons than it was 6 months ago.
Why?
Because there's a little less appetite, and we have seen.
That's worrying. Why is that?
Not for good projects. Not for good projects. No, but certainly if you're not well established and well known in the ecosystem, no, there is a little less appetite. I think. I think one has to be aware that some projects go into it and are not successful, and usually they're not the best ones. But even very good ones I have seen have failed to succeed, and so that is obviously a function of the team, but also the market environment, market sentiment, and a whole number of other things like allergies to the regulatory uncertainty and so on. So the can you will depend also on the month, I think, a little bit. Then, you know, the other, just to kind of close up, I think we've got a few more minutes. The other thing we had discussed was what should you do if you can't or shouldn't or don't satisfy any of these conditions or not enough of these conditions to do a token through whichever route. What should you do and how can you ensure the success of your project through other means?
Right. In many cases, it almost seems like the better question is do we really need to do a token? And because I think we've made clear that it's kind of a hassle. There are definitely much easier ways of going about fundraising now. Perhaps it was easier in the past. So what other things can you do? I mean, obviously, you could raise money from VCs, right? That's what they're there for. It kind of goes against the grain of the whole sort of decentralization of venture capital or whatever it was that we were thinking this was useful for. But I don't think it completely has to. So I think that probably sophisticated or accredited investors, VCs, whatever you want to call them, should be the people to put the first money in. And I think in the platonic ideal of an ICO, which I definitely want to see happen, would be that the funds received by the founders of an ICO, they should be quite within their rights to go and spend it on Lambos if they really want. I really believe, I think it's probably quite impractical, but...
Or Aston Martins.
Or Aston Martins if you're Anthony Diori, yes, sure. Because the token sale should have been able to happen once the platform was live and deployable to mainnet. And you should be able to get more than enough money to be able to make that happen. And then, once you've got your product, you're ready to sell it to the world, sell it. Your money is revenue. You do what you want with it. I suppose the practical reality of the fact is that in order to make a lot of these systems work, in order to really find out whether they're doing what you set out to do, you need it to be on mainnet because the economics just aren't going to work otherwise. So practically, I think that's very unlikely to happen, but I'm hoping there is some sort of lower bar that we can get to people having actually deployed something that's working and usable before the token sale happens, and then it makes it less likely to be a security, and it still keeps open the possibility for people to participate in these sort of project fundings or token purchases and get the same benefits without quite the same crazy level of speculative risk.
I like that the idea of a project being justified to get its Lambos. Just in that context, though, I would say there are increasingly VCs entering this space, as everyone knows, and they are more and more willing to to invest at those early stages, either through equity or otherwise.
Yep.
And I think that's actually quite healthy for the system, despite, as you say, this idea that we want to move away from them, because I think it does help to give checks and balances and to provide some discipline early on, while giving some runway while people.
And as I said earlier on, in the very early stages, it's really hard to know whether you can even sell a token or whether it's appropriate to. So selling equity is quite good, because you can have that convert to tokens at some point in the future. If you think that this is in fact going to be a completely tokenized system and the company will ultimately be pointless, or you can just do with a safety type agreement or some more sophisticated thing that's probably emerged since.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing one can do if you can't or shouldn't do a token is just button down the hatches,
right,
and live on beans. That's the old-fashioned way.
It is the old-fashioned way. And you've got projects that are doing great things on that basis, like OrbitDB, who did this crazy thing of having a completely working product that developers could go and use their decentralized database before even raising venture capital money, which was amazing.
By the way, there were many of the big projects now, many of the ones who've raised money in the last 12 months or more, who were doing that for years beforehand, by the way, so had actually come a long way. The other thing that one can look at, and again, I think this is also an emerging important part of the ecosystem, is platform partnerships.
Right, and like ecosystem funds. Ecosystem funds,
right. Both grant funds, but also we're seeing some of the projects developing their own incubation platforms, either through grants or direct investment in projects which utilize their platforms.
Yeah, and insofar as, I mean, the one limitation with a lot of grant-type programs is that that's not really a way to fund a business. A lot of people are often wanting to create something that is going to create returns. They're looking for something that's going to behave like a company, but a grant is not a way to fund a business necessarily. So hopefully, I'd like to see more projects in the space creating sort of longer-term incentives for people to be building with their protocols, so that we have fewer tokens, perhaps, and provide that sort of as a revenue stream almost.
I think that's going to be quite an interesting aspect, and I think, again, as a community, I'm also quite interested in the idea of cross-pollination between those platforms and projects, so that you could sort of pick a mix and,
totally.
and collaborate.
That's one of the key promises of Ethereum, really.
God bless Ethereum. On that note, I think we may have time for one question, but
I don't know. I think
okay,
we're getting ushered off the stage.
Okay, we're pressured off.
One question. One question. No questions. That was definitive, apparently. Okay, one.
Can you do mic number one, please?
This looks like it's going to be a hard question.
So I'm curious whether having an operation that uses two tokens, one which, for example, its utility is to drive governance of the network of the other. And I'm wondering whether there are projects like that, whether you guys have thought about or seen that, in order to be able to have an actual token with some utility that is pre-active functional chain.
Interesting.
C20 token for governance.
I mean, yes, possibly. It's really. Oh, do you mean whether it would constitute a security or whether it be?
Mostly whether it be interesting from an investor point of view and from a token architecture point of view.
I've seen some of those dual token.
I mean, basically that's what Maker has, right? They have like MKR as a sort of governance token-ish, and then DAI. So and then also Gnosis has No and I forget what is it Wiz? I forget what, I think it was renamed. So there are a few sort of dual token model things out there. Whether a token that's issued and it's got functionality in a certain context, it could be possible, certainly. If it's predominantly used for the governance of that protocol, I mean, that's kind of what the token in any given colony is for its internal governance. I think it largely depends on the specific circumstances around that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, from an investor's point of view, that can add a level of complexity both on the regulatory legal side and from an analytical side, which is not to say that one can't or shouldn't, but I mean, it can be done.
It's one of those annoying questions where the answer is it depends.
Yeah. So there we go. I mean, let's try and build some good tokens.
Yeah.